Lexington was right on that route, and it had a nice big industrial plant there. Then in 1985, New Holland merged with another firm, and they closed the plant. You can imagine what happens to a town like Lexington, 10,000 people, and suddenly 1,500 jobs up and leave, well-paying jobs, nothing to take its place. Lexington looked for several years to replace those lost jobs. In the meantime, the population drops to somewhere around 6,000 people. The town looked awful, a lot of empty homes, boarded up storefronts in the small downtown, just a disaster. Many people just left. And finally, the town was able to convince a meatpacking firm to take over that plant and turn it into a meatpacking plant. And people showed up to work there, largely Hispanic workers, some straight from Mexico, some from other parts of the country. In fact, the firm advertised in Mexico looking for workers. And the workers arrived, and the population very quickly went back to 10,000. It was a very segmented labor market in that the immigrants worked in a meatpacking plant, everyone else worked elsewhere in the community. So what it allowed us to do in that case was to analyze the impact of the arrival of the immigrants on the rest of the community, because it kind of self-segmented. We could analyze non-manufacturing activity and take that in and see how that was influenced by the sudden rise in manufacturing activity, being meatpacking in this case. And we were able to find a fairly significant effect from that. And where that fits in is that we noticed what was going on in Lexington was not what the standard labor market model of immigration would prescribe. If you think of just simple supply and demand diagram, again, I'm not putting up any PowerPoints this morning because I think PowerPoints at 8 o'clock in the morning is just unusual punishment, so I don't want to do that. But essentially, if you think simply of a labor demand curve and a labor supply curve, if you move the supply over, you go down the demand curve and wages are supposed to fall. That's the standard model, and that's why it often kind of perpetuates this image that the arrival of a large number of immigrants is somehow detrimental to the community. It's going to lower wages and incomes. And indeed, if you look at that very simplistic model that way, that's exactly what it shows. Is this the truth? Well, we looked at Lexington, and after the arrival of the immigrants and the opening of the meatpacking plant, we noticed that downtown suddenly there were no more boarded up stores. There were a lot of new stores, many of them with Spanish written on the windows, and very different businesses. We noticed that there weren't any more empty homes. The homes were full, often rented. People were home and we finally found some income with these homes. And pretty soon a super Walmart opens up in Lexington. You can imagine what that does to the status of the town in Nebraska when Walmart shifts to a super Walmart. Now, I'm being a bit sarcastic here, but nevertheless, what we noticed in effect, that there was more immigration and downward pressure on wages, that there was in effect a demand effect. And that's a lot of the research that Berg and I have done, is to look beyond that immediate labor supply side of the immigration picture to the demand side in the economy. That is, workers, when they arrive, receive income, and some of that income gets spent in the local community. That is, the workers to some extent employ themselves once that money churns around the economy. And what we wanted to do was to try to get a handle on how large is this effect. What does it do for the community? So we compared Lexington with other similar communities that didn't receive immigrants, and as I said, we were able to very nicely separate the effect of the arrival of immigrants to one part of the economy and measure the spillovers in the other part of the economy, because early on, certainly the first 5 to 10 years, the Hispanic immigrants and migrants, in some cases, again, some came from other parts of the country, others came from outside the country. The migrants who arrived essentially all worked in this one industry and had not yet begun to spread through the rest of the industry. So statistically, this allowed us to separate the segments and find the cause and effect. And we found that, in fact, that demand effect was quite strong, that in effect, helped explain why Lexington suddenly looked much better. And in fact, the town of Lexington outperformed other similar towns in South Dakota, in Nebraska, similar circumstances. That is, it did much better, or in short, immigration seemed to be an advantage rather than a disadvantage. So that was our conclusion from the study in Nebraska. Well, since then, I've thought much more about this whole way that economics tends to study immigration. Again, the simple labor market model clashes so much with the actual experiences that we see. What we noticed in Lexington, that this was not a disaster for the community, quite to the contrary. It took a community that was in a dismal condition and revived it, very much so, to where Lexington is a very good-looking community today. Again, half the community of Lexington, of 10,000 people there today, 5,000 are of Hispanic background, and Spanish is kind of the language on the street in Lexington in many ways. But it's a very healthy, good-looking community. So something good went on. And it also kind of reminds you that, in the United States here in general, we pride ourselves on being an immigrant country. Indeed, if we just followed the labor market model to where large inflows of immigrants drive down wages and depress incomes, if that were the case, given that the U.S. has received more immigrants than any other country in the world, we should be one of the poorest countries in the world. Of course, quite to the contrary, we have a very prosperous and well-to-do country because of the immigration. So where does the economic theory go wrong in matching some of these real-world experiences? I should give a little caveat here that I don't want to imply that immigration is always a wonderful thing. Just being in Nebraska as well, if we go back 150 years, that previous wave of immigration, the large one, where all the Germans and Czechs and Norwegians and whoever else came to Nebraska that day, when they arrived, again, that wasn't all that positive an experience for the Native Americans that were there prior to that wave of immigration. So there are certainly negatives. A lot depends under what circumstances the immigration takes place. It can morph into theft and oppression and some very negative consequences. But again, the labor market models doesn't deal with that as well. So we begin to expand our views. One of the follow-up studies that we did is looking at some of the statistical results that have been done in economics. And this is kind of a separate area. It's related but separate. Looking at, again, actual figures where you run regressions and try to find correlations. And the way economics has often done this is to look at special episodes of immigration where large numbers of people came in short periods of time, and then to see what are the effects of this. And one of the best-known studies in this regard is the David Card's 1990 study of the Mariel boat lift. You may have heard of this. This goes back actually to 1980, when Castro in Cuba suddenly allowed Cubans to leave, provided they left through the port of Mariel, and that essentially someone sent the boat to pick them up. About 100,000 Cubans arrived in Miami during one summer of just a couple of months. And think of what that allows you to do as a study of this sudden surge of immigrants, and surely